Wine sat at her study table, her pencil moving delicately over the paper as she sketched hairstyles. Her brows furrowed, lips pressing into a thin line as she stared off her incomplete design. Jungkook launched on the bed behind her, his phone in hand. Though his expression was indifferent, his eyes occasionally flickered to her, silently observing. How do I cut these layers? The stylist explained it, but I forgot. Should I ask Jungkook? But what if he gets angry? One bite her lip, her confusion evident on her face. Jungkook noticed her hesitation, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Finally, he broke the silence. What's wrong now? Wine jumped slightly at his voice, turning to look at him. She hesitated, her fingers fit getting with the pencil. It's about the shag wolf cut. I can't remember how to cut the layers properly. Jungkook stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a cold tone, he spoke. You don't even remember something as simple as that. It's basic. Start from the crown and layer it down, shorter at the top, longer toward the ends. Don't overthink it. His words, though sharp, were precise. Wine's face lit up in understanding. Oh, got it. Thank you, Chonko. She gave him a bright smile, the kind that seemed to momentarily soften his gaze. But before she could say more, the door creaked open. Her mother in law stood there, her icy demeanor filling the room. Her sharp eyes darted between Wine and Jungkook, her tone cutting as she spoke. Mother in law, I see you are both busy. Wine, shouldn't you be preparing dinner by now? Or do you need someone to remind you about your responsibilities too? Wine quickly stood, bowing her head. Yes, I will get to it right away. As she hurried out, Chunguk's jaw tightened. He said nothing, returning to his phone, but his eyes lingered on the door long after she left. The dining table was quiet except for the clinking of utensils against plates. Wine sat nervously, glancing at Mrs. Jones, who maintained her usual cold expression while eating. Chongkok, seated across from Wine, appeared indifferent, his focus seemingly on his food but occasionally glancing her way. After mustering enough courage, Wine hesitatingly asked, her voice soft and unsure, how's the food, Mrs. Jones? Mrs. Jones looked up briefly, her expression unchanging. It's okay. Wine's hopeful expression faltered. Oh. Mrs. Jones placed her fork down and leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze fixed on Wine. Let me make something very clear. If you lose that competition, I will not forgive you. And if that happens, I will ensure Clara marries Jungkook. Instead, you understood what's at stake, don't you? Wine's breath hitched, her eyes welling up with tears. She quickly stood up, bowing slightly before retreating from the table. Her soft sniffles echoed faintly as she disappeared down the hall. Jungkook's jaw clenched, his chopsticks pausing midair. He looked up at his mother, his voice steady but cold. Mom, I will never marry Clara. Mark my words, and Wine will not lose the competition. Without waiting for a response, he stood and left the room, his steps brisk. Mrs. Joan clenched her jaw, her sharp nails tapping rhythmically against the table. After a moment, she smirked, her voice laced with cleverness as she murmured to herself, "Let's see about that Shonko." Back in the room, Wine quietly sat at her study table. Her fingers trembled as she picked up her pencil, her earlier sketches staring back at her. She took a deep breath, her soft voice breaking the silence as she spoke to herself. "It's okay, Wine, you can do this. You have worked so hard for this competition. Don't let anyone's words shake you. Prove them wrong. Prove to yourself that you are not a failure." Her voice waved slightly, but she continued, her determination slowly returning. "You have faced wars before. You are strong, and you will make it through this too. Just focus one step at a time." Jungkook stood just outside the door. He had come to check on her, but her soft, trembling voice made him freeze. His hand clutched the doorknob tightly, the veins in his arm taut as he listened. Jungkook stepped away from the door, his thoughts tangled. He didn't want to disturb her. She clearly needed the space. So he walked back to the living room for a while, distracting himself with the occasional scroll through his phone. But after some time, he returned to the bedroom. He quietly entered, careful not to draw her attention. One was still engrossed in her work, her pencil gliding over the paper. Junko glanced at her briefly before laying down on the bed, pulling the blanket over himself. He closed his eyes, his breathing evening out as the hours passed. When he stirred 3 hours later, the faint scratch of Wine's pencil was still audible. Jungkook peeked out from under his blanket, propping himself up on one elbow. His dark eyes scanned the room until they landed on Wine. She was at her desk, completely focused, her brows slightly furrowed, her lips mouthing silent instructions to herself as she worked on her sketches. He frowned slightly, the usual coldness returning to his expression. Still at it, does she ever stop? Yet, despite his harsh inner thoughts, there was a flicker of something softer in his gaze. He sat up fully, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "How long are you planning to sit there? Are not you tired?" Wine turned her head, startled. She blinked a few times, her cheeks slightly pink. "Oh, I didn't realize you were awake. I just wanted to finish this draft." He scoffed lightly, but there was a trace of concern hidden in his voice. "Drafts won't matter if you collapse from exhaustion." His words were curt, but Wine catch the underlying care, making her smile faintly. She nodded, setting her pencil down for a moment. "Okay, I will take a break soon. Thank you, Jungkook." Wine gave a small smile, her voice soft as she spoke. But instead of ignoring her like usual, Jungkook's voice cut through the silence, colder than she expected. "Not soon. Now come to bed." The sharpness in his tone made Wine freeze. Her eyes widened slightly, and she quickly nodded, fumbling to turn off the lamp on her study table. Her hands trembled as she tidied up her desk, stealing a glance at Jungkook, whose expression was unreadable. She whispered softly, almost herself. Okay, I will sleep now. Jungkook watched her from the corner of his eye, his face calm but his piercing gaze following her. Every movement as Wine hesitantly climbed into bed. She kept to the farthest edge, pulling the blanket over herself. Her heart raced, her mind replaying his tone. She didn't dare say another word, laying still as she tried to relax. Meanwhile, Chokuk turned to his side, his back facing her, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Scared again, huh? Cute. He closed his eyes, the faintest trace of amusement lingering on his face as the room fell into silence. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains as Wine sat at her study table, flipping through her notes. Her fingers traced over the highlighted sections she had memorized over the past year. This competition held only once every 3 years was her chance to fulfill her dream. You have worked hard for this wine, one step closer to opening your own studio, becoming a senior hairstylist. This is your passion, and you are not going to let anyone stop you. She exhaled deeply, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the pages. Just then, Chongkok stirred from his sleep, his dark hair messy from the pillow. He glanced at her, his brows furrowing slightly before he silently got up and headed into the washroom. By the time he returned, one was still at her desk, her nervous energy almost palpable. Jungkook began getting ready, buttoning his shirt with practiced ease. As he adjusted his watch, his sharp eyes cast the way Wine fidgeted with her pen, lost in thought. Wine, his deep voice startled her, and she returned to face him. Yes. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable as usual. After a brief pause, his words came out in a tone softer than she expected. Good luck, you will do well. Wine blinked, her lips parting in surprise. For a moment, she couldn't find the words, but then a small, genuine smile spread across her face. Thank you, Jungkook, that means a lot. Though his face remained impassive, something about the way she smiled made his chest tighten. He turned away quickly, brushing it off. Don't make me regret saying it. After breakfast, the Joan family headed to the venue, Seoul Elite Studios, a prestigious location known for hosting Korea's most competitive hairstyling events. The grand building stood tall, its sleek design glinting under the morning sun. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. Contestants hurried about, checking their tools and stations. Wine held her equipment tightly, her steps faltering as her nerves crept back. Shungak walked behind her, his gaze flickering to her tense shoulders. He didn't say anything, but his presence seemed to ground her. Mrs. Joan, on the other hand, looked as cold and calculating as ever, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Don't forget what he said. Winning isn't an option. It's the only acceptable outcome. Wine swallowed hard, nodding quickly, I will do my best. Jungkook shot his mother a look but said nothing, his hands tucked into his pockets. As Wine approached her assigned station, she took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around her jewels. The tension in the room was palpable as the host called the contestants one by one. Only 12 had made it this far, each having passed a test to prove the skills. Among them was Clara, Mrs. Jones Nice, who stood with a smudge expression as she waited for her turn. As the host called out the last name, the atmosphere grew more intense. The contestants stood at attention, their hands clutching their tools, ready to begin. And now let's welcome the judges, Mr. John, Mrs. Lone, Mr. Han, and our special guest, Mr. Park. The judges made their way to the front, Mrs. John. The senior stylist had a stack of papers in her hands, each with photos of the various hairstyles the contestants would recreate. Her eyes scanned over the images, her sharp gaze never wavering. Mr. Han, a middle aged stylist with a reputation for precision, adjusted his glasses and nodded to the contestants. Jungkook stood a little further back, his eyes glued to his phone, barely paying attention. Besides him, Mr. Park, another renowned hairstylist, gave the room a friendly smile, though he appeared just as serious as the rest. Mrs. Jones' fingers tapped against the paper, her expression calculating as she flipped through the pages. After scanning the hairstyles, her eyes narrowed. She picked the most difficult one, an intricate layered bob with symmetrical angles that would require both precision and creativity. She wrote Wine's name next to it, a small, satisfied smirk playing on her lips as she folded the paper. Let's see how well you can handle this wine. As the judges took their seats, Mr. Han, the competition's official announcer, stood at the podium and raised her microphone. Welcome, contestants. Today is your chance to show the world what you are made of. You will be recreating the hairstyle assigned to you, and your skills will be judged based on creativity, precision, and technique. You will have 2 hours to complete your design. Good luck. Her voice echoed through the room as she glanced over the judges. Mrs. Jones nodded, and Mr. Park smiled reassuringly at the contestants, but Jungkook, still absorbed in his phone, didn't look up once. The host stepped back as the judges prepared, and Mrs. Jones' eyes briefly met Wine's. It was hard to tell if her look was filled with disdain or a challenge, but Wine felt it regardless. They all think they're the best. Let's see if any of them are worthy. His words were barely audible, and no one but Wine seemed to notice. She swallowed, a fear of uncertainty running down her spine. The host stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the buzzing energy in the room. Alright, contestants, you have 2 hours to complete your assigned hairstyle. Please check your papers and begin. Good luck. The contestants reached for their papers, unfolding them with eager but anxious hands. One by one, their expressions shifted from anticipation to shock as they saw the designs. Each hairstyle was a masterpiece in its own right, requiring immense skill, creativity, and precision. When Wine unfolded her paper, her breath catch the image before her was an intricate, symmetrical layered bob with razor sharp edges and faded layers framing the face. The added challenge was the undercut at the back, which needed to be styled into a geometric pattern using precision tools. This wasn't just a haircut, it was a piece of art that demanded flawless execution. Her nervousness was evident in her trembling hands. She bit her lip, glancing briefly at the judges' panel. Jungkook was still staring at his phone, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Joan, however, was watching her like a hawk, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. You can do this. You are practiced for this. Don't let her win. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her tools and got to work. Her hands moved quickly yet methodically, sectioning the hair with precision. The razor slid through the strands effortlessly, creating the sleek layers. Her focus was unbreakable even as sweat began to form on her brow. When it came to the undercut, she took her time, carving the geometric design with a steady hand. The buzz of the clippers filled the air as she etched each angle perfectly. Finally, she reached the final stage, styling the layers with a sleek, polished finish. For this, she needed her straightener to smooth out the edges and give the hair its perfect texture. But when she reached for it, her heart sank. The cord was frayed and broken. She tugged at it, trying to make it work, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic surged through her as she looked around the room. No, no, this can't be happening, not now. She glanced at the judge's table, her eyes briefly meeting Jungkook's. He finally looked up from his phone, his gaze sharp as he noticed her distress. For a moment, their eyes locked and something unspoken passed between them. But instead of saying anything, Jungkook leaned back in his chair, his face cold as ever. Mr. Park whispering to Mr. Han with a smirk. It seems some contestants are not prepared for the pressure. Wine clenched her jaw, her fingers trembling as she tried to think of a solution. She couldn't give up, not now. Wine glanced at the clock, her heart racing. Only 15 minutes were left. Panic threatened to take over, but she quickly shook her head. You don't have time to fall apart. Think fine, be creative, you have got this. Her eyes flicked back to the model in front of her, scanning the partially styled hair. Without the straightener, she needed a new approach, something bold yet elegant. Inspiration struck as she envisioned a softer, wavier finish instead of the sleek design. Reaching for her curling wand, She began creating loose, cascading waves, blending them seamlessly with the layered ball. The soft texture added volume, while the undercut design at the back stood out even more against the flowing layers. With deft fingers, she adjusted the angles of the curls, letting them frame the model's face perfectly. Her movements were swift and confident, her creative instincts guiding her. She added subtle highlights with a glossing spray, giving the hairstyle a radiant shine that catch the studio lights beautifully. As she worked, the murmurs in the room grew quieter, some contestants sneaking glances her way. At the judges' table, Mrs. Joan, art and eyebrow, clearly insecure despite herself. Interesting, she's improving. Mr. Park noticed, a faint smile playing on his lips. She's adapting. That's a skill worth nothing. Meanwhile, Chubuk leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on wine. Though his face remained cold, there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Pride, perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it. As the final seconds ticked away, Wine gave the hairstyle one last check. The curls were soft yet structured. The layers blended flawlessly, and the undercut stood out as a bold statement. Her model looked polished and confident, the hairstyle radiating creativity and skill. The host's voice broke through the room. Time's up. Contestants, please step away from your models. Wine stepped back, her heart pounding as she surveyed her work. The once possible hairstyle had transformed into something uniquely hers, a flowing blend of structured layers and soft waves. The geometric undercut adding a bold edge to the overall look. It wasn't what the original design called for, but it worked. No, it shined. The host announced the end of the round, and the judges rose from their seats to inspect the work. As they approached Wine's station, their expressions shifted. Mr. Park's brow lifted in surprise, his eyes scanning every detail of the style. Impressive. She didn't just salvage it, she elevated it. Mr. Han adjusted his glasses, leaning in closer. Creative and seamless. The waves complement the layers perfectly, and that undercut is sharp, clean work. Even Jungkook, who had maintained his cool indifference throughout, paused as his eyes flicked over the model, his lips pressed into a thin line, hiding the faintest hint of admiration. The tension in the room was suffocating as the host approached the podium with a sealed envelope in her hand. The judges had finished deliberating and the results were ready to be announced. After a thorough evaluation by our esteemed judges, we have the results. All contestants have passed except for one. The room went silent and Wine's heart dropped. She knew she could feel it. Wine, despite your creativity and effort, the judges have decided that your work did not meet the criteria provided for this competition. I'm sorry, but you have not passed. The words hit Wine like a thunderclap. Her vision blurred as she tried to process what she had just heard. She felt the weight of every late night, every practice session, every ounce of effort she had poured into her dream come crashing down. Mrs. Jones stood, her expression calm yet smudged. Wine, you did a great job, but this competition is about precision and adherence to the guidelines. Creativity alone isn't enough. Her words were sharp, disguised as feedback, but dripping with finality. Then she turned to Clara, her voice warmer. Clara, congratulations, your work was flawless. You are the winner of this year's competition. Clara's face lit up with pride. She accepted the applause, basking in the moment before turning to Wine with a smirk. Better luck next time. Clara left the stage, her confidence radiating as she walked away with the title. Wine stood frozen, clutching her apron, her heart breaking piece by piece. Jungkook's jaw tightened, his hands forming fists at his sides as he watched his mother. Without a word, he followed her mother out of the room, his anger barely contained. Meanwhile, Wine's legs felt heavy as she stepped away from her station. She returned to the quiet corner where she had left her bag, trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill. Wine, whispering to herself, her voice trembling, I worked so hard, but maybe this just isn't for me.